So I'm the church building support officer, and the role of church building support officer came out of a national project called Buildings for Mission, which was the result of an independent review done in 2017 that was a survey and an analysis of the state of Church of England buildings across the country. And as we've all just been talking about the various issues, it was determined that the vast majority of churches had a huge amount of issues. And so this independent review suggested that a dedicated person in each diocese with an allocated amount of funds would make a massive difference to how church buildings were maintained, but also the approach to maintaining them over time and therefore preventing further degradation. And so I, in Truro, am the result of that. There are 38 of us, I think, across England now. I always go to say the UK, across England. And we very much have been given devolved duty to scope the role as per the requirements of the diocese. Cornwall, as I'm sure you know from being part of national networks, is wildly different from all the other dioceses, but actually all the dioceses say that about themselves as well. So we all have our own unique challenges. So I spent the first few months of my role working out how best one person can support 298 church buildings, and haven't really come to the conclusion of how that might happen. However, the deluge of people contacting me has slowed down somewhat, and so again, with the help of Rosie, we designed and rolled out and processed the system of the Minor Repairs and Improvement Grant. So this is the grant that I administer, I manage internally. Like Ben, I don't have any decision on who is allocated the grant awards. That goes to the same independent panel, of which we have 2 members on this call. So churches are invited to apply for anything that can help preserve the fabric of their building, that can prevent damage that's occurring at the moment, and that will prevent any further damage happening in the future. So the way that I manage the situation at the moment is that generally I talk a lot like this to groups like this, or to deanery synods, or to PCC meetings, about what we can offer, what that might look like, how you go about applying it. When I came to design the Minor Repairs and Improvements Grant, again, I wrote that from scratch. So we have guidance from Buildings for Mission, which is from the church commissioners, but I wrote our guidance and our eligibility from scratch, and that's very much based around the things that are going to support Cornish churches. All of the documents are available. I'm sure everybody, if they haven't seen them already, can have them. But churches tend to contact me when either as a result of their quinquennial, to try and respond to the recommendations that are in the quinquennial, or when something has gone wrong. To summarise, there's big patterns. So people will contact me. We have leaky bell towers, so where rendering pointing has been done in cement, and therefore it's causing leaking, running water, ankle deep water. It's been an incredibly wet year this year, and that's had a huge impact on towers. Rainwater goods, again, so where drainage, drain pipes are failing and thereby overflowing, and so the water coming in through the church building. They're the 2 main reasons: drainage, and then again damp, cold, heating not working. So there's very much about the actual building. And I think this is a good point too. I think it was David was mentioning, these churches have been here since 1387. Why is this happening now? I'm a historic conservationist, and I've worked with listed and heritage buildings for about 17 years. There, I'd love to be able to answer that question. There isn't an answer. At various points in history, heritage buildings have been an awful lot higher on the agenda of the powers that be. So at one point we had the Ministry of Works, and their entire existence was to pay, improve, repair, maintain, elaborate, embellish heritage buildings. And so there was an awful lot of money available for churches to be able to do that. However, similarly, I often find records of churches in the 1600s embarking on half of a renovation project and then pausing so they could continue fundraising to then be able to do the next part. So some of it as well is 'twas ever thus, in that church congregations, worshippers, local families and communities have been responsible for fundraising to keep their churches maintained. And then many of you will have heard of the DAC, and they are the committee that manage the faculty process. Faculty permission is what we have instead of planning permission and listed building consent. So the Church of England looks after its own permissions when it comes to churches and church buildings. It doesn't go to the local authority for secular planning. And the DAC is the committee that makes the decisions about the faculty permissions. At various points in more recent history, this hasn't been the process. And this is the part that explains somewhat some of the fabric issues that we're seeing now. Changes were made to churches, both embellishments, improvements, fabric changes that weren't necessarily in the best interest of the building themselves. And it's not a precise science. I couldn't tell you the amount of hours that I've spent poring over mortar mixes and lime and where we are in the lime cycle and salt damage and why salt is, there are centuries where there's been no salt damage in buildings, and then there's others where you can see the salt moving up your pillars almost in front of your eyes. But these periods in history where there was no such thing as a DAC and faculty permission didn't go through the same stringent statutory processes as they do now, there were things done to churches that have meant that later down the line, we have an awful lot of catching up to do. So pointing in cement is one of those where, understandably, a church warden or the person who was responsible for looking after the church has seen an error, contracted a local contractor who may not be an understanding of working with medieval buildings, used cement pointing, and then 60, 70, 100 years later, the impact of that is massive. And that then involves either putting an entire tower at risk of not being safe to stand, or a huge and expensive renovation project. So I guess wrapped in that explanation is a justification, a validation of why the DAC exists, why it's important. When you are doing works to churches, depending on the work, it will either require a List A or a List B or faculty permission. List A's and List B's don't go to the DAC. They are decided by the Archdeacon. And I'm sure many of you who've been involved in this will know of Sue Thorold. She's the DAC secretary, and she manages and handles all of those applications. And faculty permission is for where you're making a material change. So that would involve perhaps having a new door. So I think it makes more sense if I bring things to life a little bit. Quite a lot of the work that was done by the Victorians, although it might have been pretty and in fashion at the time, wasn't always in the best interest of the building, or wasn't particularly sensible, or didn't take care of the building. So we have quite a lot of Victorian doors which are not only not fit for purpose, i.e. they don't keep any breeze or leaves or anything out, but then they actually detract from the natural beauty of the building. And so if, for example, a church might want to replace a Victorian wooden door with an oak frame door or automatic glass doors, that would require faculty permission, because that is the a material change to what's there already. So the minor repairs and improvements grant itself is up to £10,000 for a single project. It's split into repairs and improvements. Repairs would be all the things I've mentioned so far: repointing, drainage, decoration, repairing floors, work on bell towers, works on bells themselves or ringing platforms. I see an awful lot of very, very wet ringing platforms, ringing ceilings, bells that are out of use because the actual access to them is not safe. And the flooring itself, where water has ingressed, whether it's tiles, so they might have lifted. They are the repair side of things. Improvements is more of the kitchens, serveries, toilets, moving pews and replacing them with more flexible worship space. They are more classed in the improvements. The criteria of their minor repairs and improvements grant says that a minimum of 50% of what we spend as a diocese has to go on repairs, but then it's a devolved decision as to whether we could spend 100% on repairs if we wanted to. And that's quite a big driver for us. There's also a nod to a missional element, and we all quite often laugh about missional toilets. Previously, from funding perspectives, it was often required that there was a community element to a building before it was eligible for other larger funding schemes, such as the Heritage Lottery. And most churches can't offer community events, toddler groups, even things like cafe church, breakfast church, Christian meditation, without being able to offer a loo. And so where possible and where suitable, when churches do want to install a toilet, that would be eligible under the minor repairs and improvements grants. However, it's not often that you can install a toilet for less than £10,000. So the other side of my role is to advise churches on what other funding streams are available. And there are plenty. None of them are easy. I would love to say that they are, but they require an awful lot of work and an awful lot of preparation. But once you have done the work and preparation for one, that information is usually relevant for all of the others. So the main church funders, it's been thought for many years that the Heritage Lottery Fund does not fund places of worship. It does, very much so. In fact, their current strategy, which was launched in January last year, actually prioritises places of worship over any other heritage building, and they offer up to £250,000 in their small grant and £250,000 to 10 million in their larger grant. What's interesting about that is the small grant, up to 250,000, you can apply for that at any time. They have a monthly decision-making process and an 8-week decision process. And so they have simplified and streamlined what they do, and there is no requirement to have a community element. So you don't have to invent a toddler group to be able to qualify to apply for Heritage Lottery funding. They do have 4 pillars, one of which is organisational sustainability, which is gobbledygook to most churches and PCCs. But what it essentially means is they want to see a plan about how the project is going to be carried out. And so they have awarded grants in the past, but because of the voluntary nature of the people who carry out this work in church, often the work hasn't actually taken place. It started and it hasn't finished. And so the project hasn't actually completed. And so what organisational sustainability is project planning to make sure that the beginning and the middle and the end of the project happens. What most churches don't realise is when they want to do most of these kind of works, your first point of call is your QI architect. They know your church, they know the limitations, they know the challenges, they know what the urgent works are. Hello, Ben.
QI.
Quinquennial inspection, which is the statutory building report that is done by the again an architect who is statutorily appointed, and that every church has to have one of those every 5 years, and it comes with a set of recommendations that should create a pathway. It should create the plan of action for a church. I think at that point, I will say I've spent 9 months visiting churches. I know the reality of what it's like to look after a medieval building on your own, largely, with very little support and very little idea of who to contact and how to do things, and lots of things that are happening that need urgent repair, that you have to protect the safety. I've spent lots of conferences and meetings listening to people who say things like the PCC needs to have some skin in the game, or they need to show that they're committed. And I often feel like shouting. Most of the church wardens I meet are also the gardener, the reader, the bookkeeper, the cleaner, the absolutely everything. There is no more commitment than the people that I meet who are running our amazing churches on a day-to-day basis. So that's what, again, my role is for. Some churches are really fortunate and they happen to have a group of volunteers who are quite excited and they want to see this project through, and they see it as a duty to their community and to and to their church itself. That's amazing, but it's very, very rare. And so for anybody else, that's when you come to me and I will support you through the application process. So whether that means checking over with the Heritage Lottery Fund, their first stages are called a project inquiry. And so quite a lot of churches will send me their project inquiry document. I'll give it a quick scan and I can see whether they have attached enough significance to these 4 pillars that they require. And I keep mentioning Heritage Lottery, but it's the same with the other funders who are the Benefact Trust, National Churches Trust, Garfield Weston. They all require very similar information. So I think that's I was just seeing they were applying for a £250,000 from Heritage Lottery, past the pre-app stage, have some but need more permissions in place. Yeah, so you do definitely need to have, like Ben put his rider in his video, permission, whether it's faculty list A or list B, always needs to be in place before any funding will be granted. One final thing to mention about funding is the Cornwall Historic Churches Trust are absolutely wonderful, and they are one of the few funders who will pay up to £1,000 retrospectively for pretty much anything that's to do with a repair. So if you have an urgent repair of a drain pipe or a stained glass window or a piece of flooring or a piece of rood screen or something, and you have to have it done, all they require is the invoice, and they for repairs once per year per church, they will pay out on that. It's £50 a year to be a member of the Cornwall Historic Churches Trust, and on top of the emergency up to £1,000 grants that they offer, they also have grants of up to £10,000. So a church I've been working with recently had about 4,400 towards a £9,000 gable end repointing job. St John's in the Fields and St Ives, they had £800 for a conservation report, which was needed so they could restore their tin frieze. There's a huge variety of things that are there, but they are a really good point of call in that sense. So back to the diocesan help. If you want to apply for the MRNI, the Minor Repairs Improvements Grant, like Ben, I made it a very simple application form, and I've kept it as simple as possible. It does have to show that it aligns with our diocesan priorities, but everything will align with one of them, which is a requirement. We do ask about creation care, but clearly I'm preaching to the converted with this crowd. And also the panel do feedback on things like that. So a really good example was the very first grant that was awarded, which was a redecoration of an interior of the church in Mevagissey. And the decorator had said that he was going to use polythene, plastic sheeting to protect the church interior. And so Ben, quite rightly, and probably Julia as well, picked up on this and said, this is ridiculous. Why would anybody use that? And the decorator replied immediately saying, oh, yeah, no problem. I have some made from potato starch. It does exactly the same job. It's amazing and it's compostable. And so that's the nature of having a consultative panel, is that people can bring in their area of expertise and make sure that we're covering all bases. The people on the panel, aside from Julia and Ben, are a health and safety specialist, a retired priest who she focuses on liturgy, a conservation heritage architect who is also on the DAC, and we did have Joel from social responsibility. So presumably we'll have a social responsibility person in the mix as well. I think that's probably a pretty good roundup of me, minor repairs and improvements, buildings for mission, and other funding sources.